So, over the past few days, we here at Zuva have been trying out an awesome new artificial intelligence chatbot called ChatGPT. It was just released to the general public. A little bit about ChatGPT. It was built by OpenAI. They're a San Francisco AI company. They're also responsible for tools like the predecessor, GPT-3, and DALI 2. That was the breakthrough image generator that came out earlier this year, 2022. And here we've got some awesome folks to talk about it. So, Noah, I'm going to hand it off to you now to talk further about ChatGPT.
Thanks, Cleo. I have, in recent days, like many people in the tech world, spent a lot of time playing with ChatGPT, and I've also talked to tons of people. I've talked with Adam, I've talked with Alex, I've talked to like my kid's school principal, I've talked to like random dinner guests, company employees, all sorts of things. But as opposed to many of the conversations I've had, Alex and Adam are both pretty sophisticated on the machine learning side, both have comp sci PhDs from the University of Waterloo. And I enjoyed talking with both of them about ChatGPT, and I thought other people might get value out of hearing from them too. Wow, look at that. And photobombed as well. So with that, why don't I turn it over to people who know more about this than me. Alex, like to start?
My impressions of this are that I'm impressed with how far it's gone, how far it's come rather, especially given the architecture. I mean, I think a lot of people, pretend that this is somehow like the human brain, but these systems are very much not like the human brain. They're not architected this way, or the same way as the human brain. So it's impressive to me how good you can get given the architecture. Now, obviously the system still has a lot of the same old limitations that you've seen before from prior versions of these language models and different variations of these language models. But nonetheless, like there are times where it's truly impressive and, starting to feel like more of a general intelligence, even though it's definitely not that. It's a good illusion, put it that way.
Good segue onto Adam.
Yeah, so I think I feel the same way that Alex does. I mean, the part that's really compelling to me, having had, a lot of frustrating experiences with like in-house like conversational agents, is the fact that you're able to have like a coherent conversation, if you will, with ChatGPT, where it's like contextually able to at least remember some details, maybe not always all of the details of like your conversation over time. And I think that's the part that's most impressive to me, even though in some ways, machine learning has been trying to tackle this problem for years now. The fact that it's kind of all packaged nicely into one thing has been the point where it's like, oh, we're actually getting somewhere that feels like, again, you're talking to something that's not just, parroting some variant of what the internet has taught it. So
one of the things that's that I've found with playing with it is there's things that it does that are like really amazing that I know for us, like Alex, Adam, and I all have a lot of experience of pulling data out of contracts. And there's some things that it's done on those we've tested out and it's just like, wow, this is really, really good. It's nailing really hard stuff. There's other hard things that we've done where I think it hasn't been that great. And then there's some easy things that we've done that also haven't been that great. And I find it, like, is this ready for prime time? Or is this more a vision of the future and thought-provoking in that way rather than something that's useful right now?
In thinking on this, since Noah and I have chatted a few times about this, it's come to me that this feels something closer to maybe like the Tesla Roadster of, the mid 2000s, where it was like a vision of what, electric cars could be. And you had some cases where it worked and didn't work, and people were buying them, obviously. But it wasn't until we had the Model X and the Model 3 and stuff like that it really came into this was a thing people wanted. And I think ChatGPT is closer probably to the Roadster in the sense of you see that there could be a thing like this in a not too distant future. But because we're still encountering all of these bumps and the fact that it's not really connected to anything, nor is it even connected to itself, in the sense that if I have a conversation with ChatGPT and Noah has one, there's no shared memory, right? You're not interacting with one, giant ever-growing model of knowledge. You're interacting with a kind of frozen state that OpenAI or whomever updates from time to time, perhaps based upon some of these conversations, but it's not kind of in that state of it's connected, it's ever learning. Once we get closer to that stage where we're not interacting with, in some sense, frozen brains, if you will, in jars, that we might actually get to the closer to prime time state. But I'm sure Alex also has some thoughts on that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of issues and limitations that are involved in trying to make something like this into a product. But let's for now put aside all of more like some of these issues and just look at does it produce something that is useful now today? And I think yes. I think for certain classes of product, helping to write blog posts and stuff, not as something that'll just write it that you can post it, but as a writing aid, naming aid. I hate naming things. It's pretty good at coming up with silly names for stuff. I think there's a lot.
You could do better than Diligence Engine, Alex?
I'm sure it can.
Alex and I have a tradition of poorly naming stuff that only went away when we started to get teammates in.
Yeah, so I do think there's a lot of applications that it can work with today, as long as users are willing to accept the limitations and, in a human in the loop fashion, I think it can be useful. That said, practically, there's things like the cost. No one ever talks about the cost of running this thing. And I mean, even right now, the OpenAI has a free demo for everyone to use. I am sure they're spending enormous amounts of money on compute costs just running this thing. And certainly from our experience selling machine learning software, the cost is a real issue for businesses. When it comes down to actually using it, that starts to matter. The per API call cost and whatnot. If you're saying that it's going to be 10 times, 100 times what it is today, that is an issue. But even more beyond that, these models are still susceptible to the same old problems that they had before. For example, it is very sensitive to your input. You can have a slight paraphrasing of the same question, and it will give you a drastically different answer sometimes, like not slightly different, drastically different. Or, not even worse, sometimes, it'll give you answers that are 80% right and 10% wrong. And that is in a way more dangerous than giving you an answer that is 100% wrong or 100% right, because, it has the illusion of being correct, but some key aspect might be wrong, which depending on what you're using it for, could be quite dangerous. If you're writing something about, medical or health issues, that could be quite dangerous, right? Or legal issues. If you're writing about legal issues and you get some critical detail wrong and someone goes and uses this and as, legal advice, which they shouldn't, but they might, that could be very bad as well. That's to say nothing of bias and these things that creep in there, and the creators of these systems are trying to prevent some of these bad effects, but I think ChatGPT shows that it is still quite easy to circumvent their protections and get it to say some pretty egregious things.
Yeah, I think when we've played around with it with contracts, which again are this area that we know pretty well, we found that my experience has been you can get it to do some really, really, really amazing things, but it also makes a solid number of mistakes that I think a state-of-the-art old style system might not make. And so to me, it's kind of interesting to meld it together and use it as an input for certain types of questions, but maybe not for everything just yet. Do you think this is kind of like self-driving as another analogy, where it's something where it seemed like we were really, really, really close to self-driving. There sort of is self-driving now. Like I have been in a self-driving situation with Alex. But I would say, it's not like Alex is getting driven around every day in self-driving mode. Like theoretically, maybe one could, but I don't think you do. And do you think this is that kind of situation where it seems really good, and then it's the edge cases that end up being really hard?
I mean, I think some of this comes down to the fact that it would be closer to self-driving in my opinion, if it were closer to being closer to like an autonomous system or an autonomous agent or whatever you want to call it, where it's able to see and interact with the world in some, non-trivial way that just isn't you prompting it to respond. In the sense that,
so like, if it could reach out to you and be like, your hair looks beautiful today,
or
like,
or we noticed, the milk was low in your fridge today. Perhaps you want to do this, right? And there are like, refrigerators that might actually do this for you, but in some cases that might be more trying to game your purchasing habits and frequency and stuff like that. Or it's potentially, and this is where things start to get maybe a little creepy. It's having the system, integrate with your in-house, heating and stuff like that, and being like, you look a little cold. You put on a sweater. Do you want me to turn up the heat or things like that? Right. It's that's when you start getting into the arguably something closer to, I think, self-driving or full self-driving or whatever you want to call it. Because right now this is still just human initiated. And I mean, to a certain extent, so it's self-driving, but in an ideal world, it probably isn't, right? It's, I get in car, I tell car where I want to go, and then do nothing else.
I mean, I think to me, a bigger difference between something like this and something like self-driving cars is that, at least with self-driving cars, there's a very clear problem that you get in the car, you tell the system where you want to go, and it will get you there, presumably safely without killing anyone, right? There's very clear metrics of good and bad and intent. One of the main challenges for this system, I think, is lacking exactly that. I mean, it was essentially built from what I've read to produce good responses, where the definition of good is, for a given conversation, it is something like a human would say. But that's very broad, and if you start going to any given task, that is not the objective, right? Like, it is maybe part of the objective, but it is not the end goal, right? So, to Adam's point, if you want the system to help you figure out your daily tasks or whatnot, that is a much more constrained problem that it is not explicitly trained for. And in fact, it is difficult to train it for the average person, right? Or for the average company. This system like this is not easy to build to start with, and improving on it is also challenging. There are techniques that are not as costly as building the whole things, for sure, but it is still, I think, a very open problem of how do you take a system like this and tune it towards a given task. At the end of the day, and I think this is something that Tesla probably gets right, although it remains to be seen, is that how good your machine learning system is depends a lot on how fast you can go through the test, deploy, train, test, deploy cycle. And with something like ChatGPT, that is actually very slow, right? Like, they trained it once, which is a monumental task, and you can test it, but we don't have a good feedback, right?
April of 21 or something like that, seemingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to say, hey, like to Adam's point about the system not remembering things, right? Like, it doesn't remember the conversation I had with it when you talked with it. And maybe you would want to, if it's a personal assistant, for example, I would want it to remember my past conversations. How do you do that? How do you get that training back into the system in a more permanent way rather than what you have today? If you wanted to tune it towards answering legal questions, how do you enrich its knowledge with legal questions, right? Like, it's a disclaimer very clearly on the ChatGPT says that, events past a certain date it might not know about. Well, we want it to know about that. So to make it into a practical system, you have to have an ongoing way of training it that is cost effective and feasible for more than just the top, companies in the world. So I think these are just growing pains. I think we'll probably get there, but these are some of the challenges and limitations of the system today.
Shifting away a little bit from the machine learning and more to the implications of it, one of the things that both sort of terrified and excited me when I first started playing with it, and I realized that it was pretty good at answering things like essay questions and the like very well, was, what does this mean for me and other people who are kind of knowledge workers who are used to not having their labor be easily supplanted? Like, I think with Kira and then with Zuva, we enhance people, but I think this gets a fair bit farther at its best moments, a fair bit farther down the path, right? Like I had a university professor over and had her enter an exam question that she might give one of her students, and she said, like, performed really well on that. I think with blog posts, a bunch of us have tried having it help us generate blog posts, and they may be perfect, but they're pretty far down. How and well, as we played, or as I've played more with ChatGPT, I think I've seen some more of the limitations, but it still is pretty kind of mind blowing as a demo of capabilities that are only going to get better and better. How do you think that a person should think about what tasks and what skills they should be trying to optimize right now as these things get better? What should Khalil do, or what should Noah do to make myself be like, or let's think about Khalil, right? Like, I don't know, like I'm old. I could just go like retire and sit by the beach if it doesn't work, or like if I can't figure out how to work in the future. But Khalil, he's got a whole life ahead of him. What are, like, let's say Khalil's job at Zuva is generating content. Khalil does a very, very, very nice job with videos and stuff, but like for blog posts and the like, I don't think we can replace Khalil yet. But like, what if GPT-4 is twice as good, or 5? Don't worry, Khalil, we're not like looking at. But what would you ask to Khalil to stay relevant?
I mean, I think the easy near-term answer is to just point out that all of these systems are still essentially require a human in the loop somewhere. So even though it can write blog posts, you're not just going to trust it. You're going to edit it. You're going to make sure it's right. You're going to, if it's generating wrong facts, you'll correct it. You'll correct the phrasing perhaps. So someone like Khalil can produce more just with one person, right? Like, I think that's the obvious immediate answer, although that doesn't actually solve, I think, the broader question that you're touching on and that people are worried about, is that, well, that maybe means we need less people to do writing or to do image generation or whatever overall. And I don't have a good answer to these questions. I think this is the age-old question of technology. Technology is always promised to automate our jobs, especially ones maybe we don't like. Now they're automating jobs we maybe do like, which is a difference. What do you do about that? I mean, yes, people will have more time on their hands. Maybe we can all do more things, or maybe we can do different things. I don't know. It's far beyond this conversation to touch on the societal impact at that level. But certainly in the near term, these are still human in the loop systems. And so becoming familiar with them and using them as a tool among many tools, recognizing all their limitations, I think is the way to go.
I think even beyond that, if we look at how even things have progressed through automation in factory work and stuff like that, it's not that we don't have carpenters now. We still, in fact, have many, many carpenters that make very successful livings making furniture. And it's because not everyone wants mass-produced furniture that's produced by IKEA, and sure, IKEA makes perfectly good stuff, but not everyone wants IKEA furniture. They might want furniture that has living edge or this or that, and so you're still going to have a market for human only written content or human only generated content, whether that's art or text or something else. But I think even there, it's also going to come down to the fact that some of the human in loop stuff that Alex was talking about is also going to come down to making sure that you're also not perhaps incorporating information that you shouldn't. And so this is where some of these models like ChatGPT and GitHub's Copilot start, pushing the boundaries of what is copyright infringement. Can one launder copyright information through one of these models? And if it happens to reproduce it, is that infringement? Do you need to care about whether or not it's infringement, right? And that's still potentially a job for the Khalils of the world to make sure that they're not accidentally recreating a Song of Ice and Fire so that George R.R. Martin doesn't come after us for copyright infringement or something like that. That stuff, I think, is still going to exist, and it's going to exist in a different form than maybe it does now.
Yeah, you and I spoke about this, Adam, where it's a really interesting point that in the previous world episode, coming up with a blog post, like Khalil or someone like him might well have gone to a bunch of different blogs and seen how they answered a certain question and then written something up on the basis of that. Maybe it would have just come up, ideally you would have come up with just original content, but it wouldn't be surprising if you looked at how other people had answered the same question, but you would know that you looked at these other posts and ideally endeavored to make your post kind of different. And I think one of the weird things about ChatGPT is you don't really know when it's pulling something verbatim versus saying the same thing but in synonymous words versus making leaps. Like, who knows how it's getting to stuff? And I think it could, as Adam suggests, trigger a whole lot of inadvertent plagiarism or other copyright infringement.
I was just gonna say, or also, like, how does Google view this content, right? Like, Google will elevate quote unquote helpful content, but if there's just more and more similar helpful content, what rises to the top, right? What value does the craft or the experience or the perspective that sits on top of that similar content, how does that, like, is that what makes the difference of what rises to the top and is more visible than something that doesn't have it, right?
One thing that people miss is that some of what we just discussed is not actually a new problem, but it's a matter of scale, right? Like, so if you think about art forgeries, I mean, this is the same issue. It's like, does it devalue a Picasso if someone makes a, copy of it by hand? It's definitely a skill to do that, right? And if you can barely tell the difference, does that devalue the original? Well, no. I mean, I think it's very clear in the art world that doesn't. And there are certainly issues around forgeries and whatnot, or even artists impersonating another artist's style. How far is too much? These are already existing problems. They're not new problems.
You get the same thing where it maybe is devaluing with luxury brands, right? Like someone carrying around like the knockoff Louis V bag or something possibly does hurt Louis Vuitton's brand in a way that like a Picasso inspired work might not.
Sort of, yes and no. I mean, certainly people who value the brand would still value an original, and if they knew it was a knockoff, they would not value it, right? Like, I mean, I'm not saying there aren't issues with knockoffs, there are, but all I'm saying is that it's an existing problem and that has basically been made worse because now it's much easier to forge a Picasso or to make knockoff things, or to make art inspired in another artist's style. And I think it's a matter of scale. I do think John's point is also relevant that, in a society now where it's very easy to create content that is good by some definition, what does that mean for search? And what does that mean for, the things we value? If as humans, we value other humans' ideas and opinions and creations rather more than we value the machine generated, if that is the case, then, and if you wanted to search for human generated content, can you do that? Is that something we should even be doing? I mean, I don't know, but I think all of these questions are now coming up, whereas people are like, oh wow, do I really want a page full of AI generated results? I don't know. I don't know about the answer for myself. I mean, in some ways, if they answer my question, I guess it's fine. On the other hand, if it makes it harder if they don't answer my question and it makes it harder to find the thing that really does, then that's not going to be great. So
the point about the generated content is already even becoming a problem with ChatGPT, where there are, communities on the internet that have already started prohibitively banning stuff that they can tell is generated by ChatGPT, because ChatGPT also has a very recognizable voice. And so they have already started banning content that's generated with it because it's low effort and doesn't contribute to the discourse or whatever the aims of the community are. So I think it's already started in some ways. So now, whether or not it continues is different depending on, whether or not ChatGPT persists or is active for a little while and then dies until the next OpenAI, tech demo or product release or whatever, and then it comes up again and then ebbs and flows. Like, we'll see.
It's interesting. You see the same with the images, right? Like stock imagery sites are like have battlegrounds. Some are saying, yes, we allow AI content. Some are saying, no, we're banning AI content. And so I think we're going to see that with text as well, for sure.
Makes sense. Thanks so much for talking, guys. To people who watch this, I hope you found it useful and interesting. I think we're all still kind of thinking through this and learning about it. And for me, it's been super thought-provoking, and I enjoy that. So try it out, see what you think, and feel free to let us know as well. Thanks very much, Alex, Adam, and everybody who watched.